to as JHC from now on. We are a destination for exploring and preserving the histories of Jewish families and institutions in New England and beyond. We do this through our archival work, educational programs and exhibits, and public events. And really, we do this by telling the stories about our collections and the people that are represented in these collections. Abraham Captain Ratshesky, known as Cap, was born in Boston on November 6, 1864, to Asher and Bertha Abrams Ratshesky, Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe. And just to give a little insight into the Boston Jewish community at the time of Cap's birth, it was really small. In 1840, there were about 40 Jews in Boston, and by 1861, the number had grown to about 1,000. So as you can imagine, this is sort of unusual that there would be a Jewish Bostonian family well settled in 1864 in Boston. If you compare that to New York in the same 21-year time period, New York had about 7,000 Jews in the community in 1840 and 40,000 by 1861. So New York this population was sky high in New York compared to Boston. Asher and Bertha had an older son, Israel, and a daughter, Rebecca. Bertha died in November 1875, just days after Cap's 11th birthday. In the 1880 census, Asher is listed as being married to Fanny, who was then 25 years old. Asher and Fanny had 3 additional children, Harry, Max, and Marion. Cap attended Boston Latin School, but at age 14, he left school to join his father and brother Israel in a wholesale and retail clothing business, A. Ratshesky and Sons. After Asher's death in 1891, the brothers operated the store under the name I and A.C. Ratshesky, with a store on the corner of Blackstone and Hanover Streets in Boston's North End. And if you wanted to take a walk during lunch, you could go down there and check out that corner. In 1895, Cap and Israel founded the U.S. Trust Company, which, unlike other institutions, provided banking and financial services otherwise inaccessible to Boston's growing immigrant population. It was during this time period as well that Cap became increasingly involved in politics and philanthropy. He served as a representative for Ward 18 on the Boston Common Council from 1889 to 1891, a member of the Massachusetts State Senate from 1892 to 1895, and periodically he served as a delegate to the Republican National Convention between 1892 and 1924. So here are some family photographs. This is Rebecca Ratshesky Morse, his sister from Bertha and Asher, Fanny Aronson Ratshesky, who was a stepmother, and his half-siblings Marion, Harry up the top there, and Max. On February 19th, 1894, Cap married Edith Schumann. The wedding was attended by 500 guests, including then-Governor of Massachusetts, Frederick Greenhalgh, and members of the 1893 State Senate, who presented the couple with a silver service and an oak case, with the names of all the Senate members inscribed on a silver plate. I know you're all jealous of that. The wedding was quite the lavish event and was written up in the Boston Daily Globe as an event of brilliance and importance. Little did they know that Edith was not particularly fond of Cap's political aspirations, because at some point after their marriage, she did convince him to leave politics behind. It was probably that plate that did it. Edith was a daughter of Samuel and Julia Schumann. Samuel was the owner of A. Schumann and Company, a wholesale clothing store. Originally from Germany, Samuel married Massachusetts-born Julia. Born on December 23, 1873, Edith was one of 4 daughters, including Stella, Irene, and Laura. And she also had 2 brothers, Waldo and Harold. So we don't know much about Edith other than she was always a very faithful and steadfast companion to Cap and his second in many of his endeavors. She did serve on the board of directors at the Boston chapter of the American Red Cross and the Country Week Association for Underprivileged Girls in Beverly, Massachusetts. And Cap often gave her credit for their philanthropic endeavors. Cap found himself working on various disaster relief commissions throughout his lifetime, including those for the 1906 San Francisco earthquake and fire, the 1908 Messina, Italy earthquake, and the 1908 Chelsea, Massachusetts, and 1914 Salem, Massachusetts fires. These experiences would be crucial when he was called upon to lead the Halifax Relief Expedition in 1917. So this is a photo of the Chelsea, Massachusetts fire. These are not from our collections. I try to give credit where I found them. And this is actually from Salem State. Yep. On December 6, 1917, the French cargo ship SS Mont Blanc, carrying wartime explosives, collided with the SS Emo, a Norwegian relief ship, in a strait known as the Narrows in Halifax Harbor. A fire broke out on the Mont Blanc and ignited the ship's cargo. Within 20 minutes, the ship exploded. Nearly 2,000 people were killed and 9,000 injured by the blast, debris, fires, and collapsed buildings. The SS Emo was en route from the Netherlands to New York to take on relief supplies to bring to Belgium. Clearance had been given to the Emo to leave port on December 5th, but the Emo was delayed when its coal load arrived late. The SS Mont Blanc arrived from New York on December 5th carrying TNT, picric acid, benzoyl, and gun cotton. It arrived after anti-submarine nets had been raised for the night, and it had to wait outside in the harbor. Within the Narrows, ships were required to pass port to port and restricted to traveling at 5 knots. The Emo departed at 7:30 in the morning on December 6th. It entered the Narrows at excessive speed to make up for its lost time and was forced to pass a tramp steamer and came up on the wrong side, starboard to starboard. So just imagine a very narrow piece of water, basically, that these giant ships are trying to pass each other on. Mont Blanc began approaching Bedford Basin at 7:30 on December 6th. Despite the ship's cargo, the Mont Blanc was not given a guard ship. Traveling into the Narrows, the captain saw the Emo coming towards them on the starboard side and risked cutting Mont Blanc off on its course. The captain issued a whistle to indicate his right of way. The Emo responded with its own blasts that it would not yield its course. With a collision imminent, both ships cut their engines, slowly drifting towards each other. The captain of the Mont Blanc gave the order to steer hard to port and crossed the Emo's bow, bringing the two ships parallel. Suddenly, the Emo reversed engines, which caused the ship's prow to swing into the Mont Blanc on its starboard side. This broke open barrels of benzoyl on deck, which flowed into the hold, and as Emo's engines kicked in, it then scraped Mont Blanc's hull, creating sparks, which ignited the benzoyl on deck. The fire became uncontrollable, and the captain gave orders to abandon ship. At 9:04 a.m., the fire ignited Mont Blanc's explosive cargo. The explosion traveled at more than 3,300 feet per second, its shockwave nearly 23 times the speed of light, and generated a 60-foot tsunami. The forces carried Mont Blanc's half-ton anchor shank 2 miles onto land, and the pressure wave destroyed a 2,600-foot square radius, including over 2 square miles of the city's Richmond district. An entire Micmac settlement in Tufts Cove was also destroyed by the tsunami. It was the world's largest man-made explosion prior to the nuclear age, releasing energy equal to 2.9 kilotons of TNT. The massive numbers of eye injuries were caused by a lot of the window glass shattering. So I don't know if people know this, but the bulk of injuries caused in the Halifax explosion were injuries to the eyes. At 11 a.m. on December 6th, nearly 2 hours after the explosion, the State House received word of the disaster. Governor Samuel McCall immediately sent a telegram to the mayor of Halifax. McCall then called a meeting of the Massachusetts Public Safety Committee, which at the time included 100 men, for 2:30 that afternoon. Even with very little notice, the majority of men were able to show up for the last-minute meeting. By that point, McCall still hadn't received any word from Halifax. So he asked Henry Endicott, manager of the Public Safety Committee, to contact the War and Navy departments in Washington, who had not heard of the disaster yet, but dispatched a telegram to Halifax on Endicott's behalf. Colonel William A. Brooks, who was acting Surgeon General of Massachusetts, suggested ordering a special train that could be staffed with medical personnel and supplies. James Eustis, who worked for the Boston and Maine Railroad and was on the committee, agreed to have a train ready by 10 p.m. that night. At 5:30 p.m., Cap received word from McCall that he was to be in charge of the expedition. This letter from McCall, seen here, was also given to Cap as an introduction to the mayor of Halifax. And it reads, "My dear Mr. Mayor, I am sending Honorable A.C. Ratshesky of the Massachusetts Public Safety Committee immediately to your city with a corps of our best state surgeons and nurses in the belief that they may be of service to you in this hour of need. I need hardly say to you that we have the strongest affection for the people of your city and that we are anxious to do everything possible for their assistance at this time. Kindly express to the people of your city the very deep sympathy of the people of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and assure them that we are ready to answer to any call that they may need to make upon us. Immediately upon hearing of the terrible blows dealt to Halifax, I sent the following telegram to you. Understand your city in danger from explosion and conflagration. Reports only fragmentary. Massachusetts stands ready to go to the limit in rendering every assistance you may be in need of. Wire me immediately." Upon being informed that the wires were out of commission, through the good offices of the federal government at Washington, this further telegram was sent to you by wireless. Since sending my telegram this morning offering unlimited assistance, an important meeting of citizens has been held, and Massachusetts stands ready to offer aid in any way you can avail yourself of it. We're prepared to send forward immediately a special train with surgeons, nurses, and other medical assistants, but await advice from you. Won't you please call upon Mr. Ratshesky for every help that you need? The Commonwealth of Massachusetts will stand back of Mr. Ratshesky in every way. P.S. Realizing that time is of utmost importance, we have not waited for your answer, but have dispatched the train. The train was carrying representatives from the American Red Cross, surgical instruments, medicines, hospital supplies, blankets, clothing, and sweaters. CAP also made sure to get letters from all of the executives of each of the 4 railroads they were to travel on, so the relief train would always have the right of way. And that was very important. Also in December of 1917, the US was involved in World War I, so anyone boarding the train was expected to show credentials to ensure they were not an enemy of the United States. Here are some examples of those press credentials from the Associated Press, the Boston Globe, and the Boston Herald, so they did have to present this piece of paper to the conductor when they boarded. Initially, the Germans were blamed for the explosion, and in Major Giddings' report after the event, he mentions the arrest of a sailor from the Norwegian boat, the Emo, who was wounded and seeking treatment at the hospital. The sailor attempted to bribe a nurse with $25 for his early release. She reported the man to Captain Lapham, who discovered a note written in German in the sailor's belongings, and the sailor also had, quote, many notes concerning the catastrophe. The transcript on December 11th also trumpeted that a German pigeon had been caught, noting that a message in German was found under its wing and that many Germans had also been arrested. The pigeon was wounded in the explosion. I am sad to say I have not been able to discover the eventual fate of the pigeon, but I was quite concerned about it. So I won't read all the names out loud, but this is just to give you an idea of who was on the train: medical personnel, the Red Cross, railroad officials, and members of the press. The train left North Station at 10 p.m. on December 6th, and from Portland, Maine through St. John's in Canada, the team continued to wire Halifax, but with no success. After hearing more news of the disaster at McAdam Junction, CAP called a meeting with the doctors, nurses, and Red Cross members to take inventory of their supplies, because he was starting to get nervous they didn't have enough with them. As they moved through Canada, people at every stop begged CAP to let them on the train so they could go to Halifax and help. He did usually comply. He gave preference to medical personnel, but he did usually let people on the train so they could go. At St. John, he instructed some of the medical personnel to purchase more supplies and medicine. When the train reached St. John, CAP and his team started to get the first real information that told the extent of the disaster, which included that all the telephone and telegraph wires were down, so the only news coming out of the city was by word of mouth. CAP wired Henry Endicott to request an immediate dispatch of a train with glass, putty, and other building materials, because he realized this was a very dire situation. At St. John, the train was stalled by a massive snowstorm and wind. A freight engine was attached to the train to try to pull it through, which was now a blizzard. The train engine, under tremendous strain, broke down, causing a delay of several hours for repairs. Finally, the train reached Folly Mountain, only to be told by the conductor that a giant snowdrift now covered the tracks and the train would have to stop. So you remember I mentioned that he had telegrams from all of the heads of the railroads to make sure that the train had right of way. So this is when Cap used that to his advantage. And the men on the train also realized that this was a very special situation and they needed to do something to get this train to Halifax. So they basically got off the train and they started to dig and push the train. So they rammed the train through the snowdrift, which Cap reported as being higher than the door of the baggage car. Finally, they got through the snow, they reached Truro, they got a new engine, a new fresh crew, which they desperately needed, and they continued on to Halifax. The train made it to Halifax by 3 in the morning of December 8th, ending at Rockingham Junction, which was 6 miles from the destroyed depot at Halifax. Cap and C.K. Howard, the general manager of the Canadian Railroad, didn't get any sleep, obviously, that night. At 7 a.m., Cap and C.K. met C.A. Hayes, a native of Springfield, Massachusetts, who was the general manager of the Canadian Government Railways. C.A. Hayes, after tearfully greeting the relief team, brought Cap and C.K. to meet Robert Borden, Canada's Prime Minister. In Halifax, all Cap could see was devastation, but he also saw a large number of people and organizations attempting to offer help. Prime Minister Borden took several members of the relief team to City Hall, and while they were on their way there, Cap learned that the driver of their car had lost his wife and all 4 of his young children in the explosion. Glass was shattered, buildings destroyed, and chaos was everywhere. At City Hall, the team was introduced to Colonel McKelvey Bell, who was in charge of medical relief. Cap noted that the small room was overloaded with men and women all attempting to organize areas of relief, while other rooms in City Hall were full of people looking for medical care, food, and clothing. Meanwhile, Cap himself had been injured. He fell in the snow earlier, but that wasn't about to stop him. So this is a telegram draft from Cap to Henry Endicott stating that there's a very urgent need of trucks with medical supplies. And so Cap began to do what he was tasked to do, which was organize. He started by meeting with Canadians in charge and diplomatically selecting a building away from City Hall to be used as headquarters for the Relief Committee. Cap was very aware that the last thing that would be helpful was being seen as a group of intruders taking over the situation. After they chose the City Club as headquarters, the Relief Committee made its way over and met with a variety of other people to organize committees. Cap was immediately tasked by his peers to be on several of these committees and run various departments. The committees and departments created were transportation, which organized the people and supplies coming from Canada and the US, supplies, which took charge of the supplies coming in and organizing into food and clothing, finance, which made sure that the money that was being raised was spent and used accordingly, construction, to identify which buildings were partially or totally destroyed and which had to be demolished, which had to be rebuilt, and how to hire labor and order building supplies. Relief was the Red Cross Committee. Housing, which helped find temporary housing for both those who lost their homes and those coming in to help, and the medical and warehouse departments, which oversaw the staff and housed the medical supplies. And the next step was to establish a hospital. Cap felt it was key to keep the medical team together as much as possible. They did find a building, the Bellevue building, but it was in a terrible state. The doors were gone, the windows were gone, and there was water and ice everywhere. However, by 12:30 in the afternoon of December 8th, with Cap running on absolutely no sleep still, the Bellevue Hospital was taken over by the crew of the US training ship Old Colony and a company of Canadian soldiers who cleaned the rooms and covered the windows and boards. By 6 p.m., the hospital was up and running and had 100 beds and an operating room and medical supplies. By 9 o'clock p.m., they had 60 patients, and by noon the following day, December 9th, they had a full house with 100 patients. So again, a good deal of the injuries were due to the shards of glass that blew everywhere in the explosion, and a number of people were blinded by the glass. When the first explosion occurred, it was somewhat minor, but it drew everybody down to the harbor, and it also drew people to their windows. So when the second explosion occurred, all the glass obviously blew inward, and that is when all those eye injuries occurred. Other reports were of shell shock and severe psychological distress, which at the time they called insanity. The Halifax Relief Expedition was not just about Massachusetts and Nova Scotia. There were relief crews from New York. British authorities stationed in Canada were also on hand to help. And of course, there were other teams from Canada as well. Nurses came from New York, England, Rhode Island, Montreal, and of course, Massachusetts. By December 12th, CAP had assessed the medical situation and determined that it was so well in hand it would be appropriate for the Massachusetts team to take its leave. By this point, more teams from Rhode Island and Maine had also arrived. On the evening of the 12th, the medical team from Massachusetts transferred the operation of Bellevue Hospital to the medical team from Rhode Island. So these are some headlines just from one newspaper article about the explosion and what happened. So you can see it's very, let's kind of get out of the way here. It gets a little bit more hysterical as it goes on. Relief work being rushed, whole families dead or scattered, harrowing scenes reported, wreck and ruin on every side, every building in the city damaged, practically all North Halifax is destroyed, several thousand tons of high explosives and much benzene on the ship that blew up. This is the same newspaper article headlines. Reports still indicate 2,000 lives lost. Hospitals, churches, schools, and private homes contain the dead. 4 relief trains rushing towards city. 3 of them are from New York and the other from Massachusetts. Bay State unit due at 9 tonight. Conditions more appalling than first thought. Ratshesky, Wyers, McCall. So it's just a sampling of headlines. So while Cap was away, I think his wife Edith was combining everything in a scrapbook. We have this giant scrapbook collection. And this was my favorite, Boston man, almost dictator over Halifax. But the article is actually very complimentary. He's a benevolent dictator. But this is really why Governor McCall put Ratshesky in charge. He needed somebody with Ratshesky's skill. Cap had experience in disaster areas, but more importantly, he knew what his strengths were and what he needed other people with expertise to do. So like any good leader, he understood that his job was to boost morale, ensure that people were there to help and had jobs to do that fit their realm of expertise. And because he trusted those people to get the job done, they respected him and allowed him to make decisions that needed to be made, and this was really important. Not being from Halifax, he could walk the fine line between empathy and resolve that I think is really required in a situation like this. The team left Halifax on December 14th and was welcomed back to Boston by a reception committee, many of whom had undertaken an incredible amount of fundraising. A rally held at Faneuil Hall, which featured speeches from Governor McCall, Boston Mayor James Curley, and Henry Endicott, updated the public about the efforts underway, including the departure of the steamship Calvin Austin, which left Boston laden with 25,000 blankets and glass for 1,000 to 1,500 houses, and a large quantity of shoes, clothing, and bedding that had been collected at City Hall. Participants at the rally were urged to bring more donations to the ship. The specter of World War I was also evident in McCall's speech. McCall said, "The appalling disaster to Halifax demands from us the eloquence of deeds and not of words. Massachusetts has already spoken. Such suffering would make a commanding appeal from an enemy, but the people of Nova Scotia are bound by traditional ties to our country and especially to Massachusetts. She has sent to us thousands of men and women who have greatly enriched our citizenship. They are ranged by our side as allies in the Great War." Within 2 days of the disaster, the committee in Boston raised $117,427. By December 11th, the committee only sought cash donations for the relief effort. Cap himself donated $1,000 to the relief fund, so that would be about $18,000 today. The committee overall raised $700,000, which today is worth about $13 million. The Halifax Committee in Canada passed this resolution, which was published in the papers. That the heartfelt thanks of the citizens of Halifax, as represented by this executive committee, be telegraphed to the Commonwealth of Massachusetts for their overwhelming sympathy, most generous gifts of relief supplies, sorely needed services of doctors and nurses in hospital units, and especially for the thought of accompanying said gifts with the services of A.C. Ratshesky, whose generous and expert advice have greatly helped to solve many of our problems, and whose sympathetic activity and tact will, we trust, soon assist us to bring comparative order out of the chaos resulting from this terrible loss of life, crippling of the living, and terrible devastation of our city. Cap took it upon himself to respond, ensuring that he named and thanked a variety of other men who worked with him to ensure that Halifax could start to recover from the explosion. In his report to Governor McCall, Cap wrote, "Your instructions to me to go the limit were carried out to the letter, and the Massachusetts relief team was the first to enter the devastated city. The results are almost incredible. The Commonwealth of Massachusetts can well feel proud of its achievement. Most importantly, Cap recognized the magnificent spirit exhibited by all the people in Halifax as the crux of the success of the Massachusetts relief train." Wouldn't you want Cap to be your boss? The city of Halifax were not the only admirers. In one letter, one of R.H. Stern's sons, Frank, writes, "You are a source of constant wonder to me. How you can keep up such terrible energy so consistently and accomplish so much. It makes me feel sometimes as if I were a slacker, although I do not intend to be." Edwin Reynolds, with the Boston Globe, wrote, "Those of us who live so near to you here, yet who have never seen you work before, have absolutely nothing but the utmost admiration for your ability and capacity for getting the right thing done at the right time. It is a pleasure to know a man such as you." On Edith and Cap's 25th wedding anniversary in 1919, the couple were lauded by many well-wishers, including Calvin Coolidge, Governor McCall, and G. Fred Pearson of Halifax, who wrote, "My dear Mr. Ratshesky, it is a very great happiness to me to be permitted to associate myself with your host of friends in this unique presentation. We in Halifax, who made your acquaintance in December 1917, a time of anxiety and great distress, will always hold your name in grateful recollection. As the Commander-in-Chief of the advance guard of devoted workers from Massachusetts, we can never forget all that you did for us. Your outstanding organizing ability, which you so unselfishly and unsparingly exerted in our behalf and for our benefit, accomplished much that we thought impossible of achievement. You taught us how to organize to overcome the difficulties with which we were confronted. You counseled us how to anticipate the happenings of many things which in our inexperience we never thought of. You were the friend and leader of every one of our workers, and everyone was your friend. You came among us a stranger, and it was with deep regret we bade you, a devoted friend, goodbye. We have good reason to know you still hold us in your thoughts, that your days and those of your good wife may be long, your opportunities for useful service multiplied onto you, and all your desires speedily granted, is the sincere wish of an admiring friend who knows something of the great good work you did in Halifax and the splendid service you rendered its people in a time when service was priceless." But perhaps the most meaningful letter sent to Cap was a letter sent to Harold Kennedy of Stoughton. This is a little bit of a around the way here, so just follow me along. A young man named Walter Hoganson. The letter was forwarded to Cap by attorney Samuel Casson. Harold Kennedy's older sister worked in Casson's law office, and she brought the letter into work one day without realizing her boss knew Cap. Walter Hoganson's sister, Catherine Hoganson Murphy, and her husband, Patrick, are listed in the Halifax Explosion Remembrance Book. On December 18th, Hoganson wrote, "Dear friend Harold, when I received your letter a few days after that horrible catastrophe, believe me, it cheered me to know of friends, and I will surely keep up correspondence. The explosion was an awful thing. I lost a married sister. Her husband was killed also. Out of the family of 5, 4 of them are alive. The other boy perished in the explosion. You asked me for my experiences. Well, I was at work at the time in the newspaper office of the Daily Echo, a Halifax paper, and about 9:05, the lights went out very slowly. I was watching the lights going out when there was a short rumble and then a big crash, a terrific, terrifying roar. I got as low as I could, and the glass and wood flew everywhere, but I didn't get a scratch. Harold, our big steady building rocked like a little cradle. I got out of that building, and when I got on the street, everybody was running everywhere. People with scratches, cuts, and bruises were yelling, 'The dirty Huns, they're here at last,' and many other things, thinking it was an air raid. Well, getting clear of this, my first thoughts were of home. Getting home, I found everybody all right. The house was all shattered, windows were cut, or were out, plaster down, and our chimney split, as if a saw had upped it down the sides, but nobody was cut. Then I made for my sister's house in Richmond, the northern part of the city where the explosion did the most damage. Well, I started off in further north, the worst it got. Houses split in half, others down to the ground, others which had escaped the explosion were burning and with a fierce fire that was raging then. Getting to Duffus Street, or what was left of it, I found my sister's house burned to the ground and not a soul around. Leaving here in despair, I went down to the waterfront, which was swept as low as a field. My chum, Victor James, was working here and he was instantly killed. His body was found since. Making once more for home, I left that field of horrors behind. That night, a wild storm howled, snow, sleet, and wind. I was expecting our chimney to fall any moment, but it lasted out all right. The next day, the work of relief started, and thank God the noble state of Massachusetts stood the same as ever, ready to help us. I tell you, I don't know what we would have done without the Americans because we were left powerless by the explosion. Well, the work of relief started. Buildings were put into shape for the injured and homeless, and a man whose name will always stand sacred in every Canadian's mind took over the relief dressing stations and hospitals. This man was A.C. Ratshesky, the hero of dear old Halifax. Well, the food stations opened and also clothing depots. At this time of writing, everything is slowly but surely getting back to normal conditions. I tell you, an American is just like our own, free, easy, cool, and ready. After this is over and everything fixed up again and our city gets to be dear old Halifax again, we will realize what the Brothers of Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Maine hospital units did for us. Hoping you will write as soon as possible. For the remainder of World War I, Cap served as Assistant Food Administrator for Massachusetts and Assistant Executive Manager for the Massachusetts Committee on Public Safety. In 1926, he became chairman of the Massachusetts Department of Public Welfare and subsequently served on various other state committees, including the Metropolitan Transit District Commission, the Massachusetts Bay Colony Centenary Commission, and the Governor's Committee on Street and Highway Safety. He was a very busy man. After World War I, Cap became involved with the activities of the American Red Cross. He was the chairman of the Boston chapter when, in November 1927, Vermont suffered catastrophic flooding. Cap once again stepped into the role of leader of relief work, and in 1930, he and Edith donated their home at 347 Commonwealth Avenue to serve as the Red Cross chapter headquarters, later purchasing this building on Gloucester Street, presenting it to the chapter when the ComAv building became too small. Cap was particularly involved in Jewish philanthropic organizations, including the Federated Jewish Charities of Boston, which is now the Combined Jewish Philanthropies, the Home for Jewish Children, the Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, and Beth Israel Hospital, of which he was one of the founders and for which he donated $200,000 to the building fund. And that says it's in loving reverence of his mother, Bertha A. Ratshesky. Cap and Edith also purchased a building in Beverly to serve as a home for children named in honor of Edith's sister Laura, who was killed tragically in a carriage accident when she was a young woman. And he was overwhelmingly involved in a variety of civic and philanthropic organizations, including serving as treasurer of the Save Old Ironsides Committee, where he oversaw the Pennies Campaign of the 1920s. The Pennies Campaign, of course, was comprised of school children throughout the nation who raised money to restore the USS Constitution. In 1930, President Herbert Hoover appointed Cap as ambassador to Czechoslovakia, where he served until he resigned in 1932. In 1933, he was honored with the Order of the White Lion First Class, Czechoslovakia's highest civil honor. On February 10, 1916, in celebration of his 50th birthday, Cap established the A.C. Ratshesky Charity Foundation, which in 1930 changed its name to simply the A.C. Ratshesky Foundation, which still operates today and continues to distribute funds to local organizations and charities. Cap and Edith did not have children of their own. Cap's sister Rebecca and her husband Jacob Morse had three sons, including Alan, who ran the bank founded by Cap, and his brother Israel. And I think that Citizens Bank became the eventual buyer of the Ratshesky's bank, I think actually as recently as the 1980s. And these are Alan's children, Anne, Edith, and Alan Morse Jr. Every year since 1971, Nova Scotia has gifted the city of Boston with a Christmas tree. On the 100th anniversary of the explosion in 2017, a monument to the relief expedition was unveiled on the Common near where the tree usually stands. The Ratshesky Foundation was born of an extraordinary gift from the Ratsheskys, a $100,000 gift to the Federated Jewish Charities. It's a gift that would be worth $2.4 million today. In an interview with the Boston Globe, Cap, who gave his wife Edith all credit for the idea in honor of his 50th year, said, "There is no great secret about succeeding in business. If a young man will apply himself to his tasks, work hard and be absolutely honest, keep his word and be temperate, he will succeed. At least I found this to be true, and I see no reason why others shouldn't succeed if they will follow this rule." When my good old father died, the Globe announced his death as follows: A. Ratshesky dead. His word was as good as his bond. I can see those headlines now. They have been an inspiration to me all my life. I hope the same may be said of his son when he is gathered onto his fathers. Abraham Captain Ratshesky died 76 years ago on March 15th, 1943, leaving his wife Edith and numerous nieces and nephews who continue to carry on their uncle's philanthropic legacy through the work of the Ratshesky Foundation. The Christian Science Monitor reported, A.C. Ratshesky was one of Boston's finest citizens. His story follows the familiar pattern of the son of Jewish immigrants who rises to affluence in the business world and to prominence in philanthropic undertakings. It is a story, nonetheless, which might inspire young men of his generation to do their utmost in utilizing the abundant opportunities of the new world. The Boston Herald extolled, not only in Boston, but the state and the nation have lost an eminent citizen. He was well known and honored as a businessman, and had he chosen to continue his political career, there are many who believe he might have reached Senate of the United States. His judgment was excellent. Men of all types consulted and trusted him, but his gifts were the best expression of his character, together with the investments of time and labor, which he made on behalf of many noble causes. And the Jewish Advocate wrote, Cap Ratshesky, as he was affectionately called, was intensely a Jew. In the early days of his career, there was no cause touching the welfare of his people that he did not evoke his generous and devoted support. But if he was zealous as a Jew, he was no less zealous as an American. Accustomed as he was to deliver public addresses, he seldom began a speech on any occasion except with the words, "My fellow Americans." He was a red-blooded and wholehearted American, and to exalt his religion and his country were the ruling passions of his life. In his eulogy for Cap at Temple Israel, Rabbi Joshua Loth-Liebman said, "His was a long and sunlit day on the garden of the earth. His was the high honor as a member of a persecuted and oppressed people to represent the new America in old Europe. He matched his ability to America's hour and made a distinguished and blessed career. He had a variety of interests, many opportunities for public and civic service. He was driven by the urge to repay to America the blessings it had given him." So we have a word in Yiddish, and that word is mensch, and it's used to describe someone who has integrity and honor, a person who's highly respected. And like his father before him, Abraham Ratshesky left an indelible mark in Boston, on Halifax and the world. So really, this should be the mensch of dear old Halifax. And I hope this story inspires all of you to be mensches and go out into the world and do good things.